We, as human beings, are at a moment, according to some, and I'm with them, a moment of conjunctive crises or challenges that raise existential questions about what we might be able to do and become as a species. I think we might want to ask, are there limits to human potential? To what extent are our societies and education systems, pedagogies around the world predicated on notions of ongoing growth and actualization? We also want to ask, why are we drawn to thinking in terms of potential in the first place? So, as a starting point, let me suggest that using the idiom of potential allows us to talk about something that does not yet exist, right? To speak of human potential exposes a gap. On the one hand, this gap can be an imaginative, perhaps even mystical space for reflecting on the human condition, a space for enacting and modifying our agentic capacities. On the other hand, this gap can also be imposed, and a not particularly liberatory distance between the actual and the possible. So in this talk, I want to approach potential as an object that circulates in the world, focusing on it as a term people use in varying ways in everyday life to name something about themselves and other people. In many of its incarnations, the notion of potential suggests a hidden force determined to manifest itself. Potential is something that has a future built into it, a future that may or may not require intervention to be realized. And the futurity of potential helps to explain, I think, why it is such an important educational keyword. And because all our futures have a past, potential is something we as historians of education should pay close attention to. Now, it's really an honor and intimidating to be invited to give a keynote at an ISCHE conference. So many people who have been up on stages like this before me have been so impressive and inspiring to me across 2 decades. So when thinking about what specifically to speak on, I was drawn back to this image you see here. I actually presented on this at the second ISCHE conference I ever went to, Geneva in 2005. And I know that at least a couple of you in the audience heard that presentation in Geneva. At the time, I really wasn't sure what to do with this turn of the 20th century photograph of some people drawing on a classroom blackboard in a pigsty. However, there's an interesting story here, and my route to it was somewhat convoluted. At the end of the hour, some of you may still think I don't know what to do with this photograph. Originally, I found it fascinating for showing an extreme example of educationalization. I mean, really, taking a schoolroom device, the blackboard, and putting it in a pigsty so that students could do nature drawings of pigs. What's going on here? However, it actually turns out, I now think, that this is not the most important image in the set it attaches to. But before I get deeper into this, I need to tell you about how I came across this in the first place, as it helps set up the problem I'm tackling. I did my dissertation research in large part in Serbia, actually in several places in archives of the former Yugoslavia, and in fact, a number of places in the corner of the world we're all in now. I was researching Yugoslav education in the interwar period, the first Yugoslavia of the 1920s and 30s. And I was particularly interested in the transnational circulation of educational ideas and practices. So it's not surprising that I spent some of my time in the National Library in Belgrade reading the journal Radna Škola, the work school or the activity school. It was linked for a time to the New Education Fellowship, an international movement and internationalist movement seeking to promote new education or progressive education worldwide. Many people in the room have written on it. So it's no surprise that I spent time with it. And I started to pay particular attention to pieces written by Paul Radosavljevic, who had become a professor of education at New York University, and whose correspondence and publishing in journals like Radna Škola and also Učitel, the main publishing organ of the Yugoslav Teachers Association, his articles seem to have been one of the major pipes in the networks that were spreading educational ideas around the Slavic Balkans in the 1920s. As with everything, there's a lot to say about Rado Savljević, whose most noteworthy English language publication was the two-volume tome, Who Are the Slavs? A quasi-ethnographic folk race theory discussion of the Slavic peoples, published in 1919. He'd come to the US in 1905 to study at Columbia after having previously studied with the German experimental pedagogue Ernst Neumann. Rado Savljević is a very interesting figure, and as we explore figures like this, it's of course necessary to do archival research on multiple continents. And I've looked at his papers at NYU. He carried on a very active transatlantic correspondence, although I will say handwritten Cyrillic has driven me to drink on several occasions. And we also have a set of his lecture notes, which cover almost every educational thinker and movement from the 1920s that you can think of. Here, for example, are some of his remarks on Tagore. In fact, it's quite appropriate that we're in the, this is actually not the Madam VIP room, this is the Nikola Tesla room, who was a Serbian-American colleague of Rado Savljević, and in fact, recently an interview that he conducted with Tesla was found and published in Serbia. So, in journals like Učitel and Radna Škola, Rado Savljević provided a regular series of short and long pieces on global education movements for Yugoslav educators. And one in particular that caught my attention was from 1927, entitled Tadove nove metode u pedagogiji. The editors announced that Rado Savljević had passed on his entire works, including this introduction to a planned book, Practical American Pedagogy, which actually seems never have been published as a monograph. But in this excerpt here, he relates some of his life story. The full article, in fact, was serialized over several issues. And by February, reading February 1928, I had figured out that Tadove was not a Serbian word I didn't know, but was rather a reference to the famous American educator, James Liberty Tad, whose work he described as danas najpopularnije kod amerikanskih učitelja, whose work is today the most popular work amongst American teachers. Now, reading this in fall of 2001 for the first time, I had never heard of James Liberty Tad. I'm gonna guess not too many of you have either, some may have. I was studying for my PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which doesn't do too badly in the history of education. Tom Popkowitz, Bill Reese, Herb Klebard. In none of my courses with any of them did I learn a thing about the late 1920s most popular American educator. And almost more astonishing was Rado Savljević's next claim. Bez tada I hala, ja ne mogu pomisliti da bi Američani bili na svojoj današnjoj visini. Without Tad and Hall, I cannot imagine that Americans would have attained their present heights. Now, G. Stanley Hall, I certainly knew about, right? And reasonable to draw attention to his influence and contributions to American education. But Tad? So quickly, who was James Liberty Tad? Well, following the example of our students, I asked ChatGPT, I apologize, but I could not find any specific information about an individual named James Liberty Tad in my database. It's possible that he is a private individual or relatively unknown figure. But at least it apologized, right? Which is more than you get from most search engines. Fortunately, we do know a bit about him. I find it appropriate and amusing that the main article on him is titled, J. Liberty Tad, Who Are You? Very quickly, and we'll go deeper into this in a second, he was a teacher at and later the head of an industrial art school in Philadelphia, active from the 1880s, pretty much up through the time of his death in 1917. He is somewhat known in the history of art education, but the most typical mention is a footnote. Page 194, note 53. And this is from a book on the Bauhaus, as some of you have already figured out. And the connection to architecture is something I'll return to. Now this is Tad's magnum opus, the 1898 New Methods in Education. We'll return to this also and go into it in some detail. But please note the epigraph at the bottom, "Be ye transformed by the renewing of the mind," a claim that suggests there's supposed to be something more going on here than art, real manual training, and nature study. And in fact, as we've seen earlier, bez Tada hi Allah, without Tad and Hall, America would not have attained its present heights. The Yugoslav educational public was led to believe that the accomplishment of a transformation was not a mere claim, but was a well-established reality. So, I think I've set the problem up. I've told you that it was in Belgrade, and thanks to a Serbian-American professor of education, writing in 1927 and 1928, that I came to learn about the work and the existence of James Liberty Tad. So now let me offer you a preview of where we're going. I'm going to take you on a journey that crisscrosses quite a few times and spaces. We'll be going to the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. We'll meet a number of people along the way, like the architects Anne Ting and her one-time professional and romantic partner, Louis Kahn. It will become clear shortly why we're just seeing the back of his head. We'll also encounter a compelling sculpture of an African-American woman who was a victim of a brutal lynching. And towards the end, we'll also talk about Abraham Maslow. There will be kittens, though if you know something about Maslow's life, this part's kind of rough. And we'll even get to Big Sur, California in the 1960s and 70s. And if time permits, we'll talk about a certain obnoxious billionaire who makes electric cars, whose name we won't mention, in this room, hallowed hall, dedicated to Nikola Tesla. This obnoxious billionaire has even shot one of his electric cars up into space, and I'm not making this up, and put it into a solar orbit. So that might be where we end up if time permits. And we'll also return to the pigsty. And we'll look at some nature study being done on a blackboard, and we know this is in the Adirondacks region of New York State, where James Liberty Tad operated a summer art program for teachers. Now, believe it or not, there is a method to this madness. What strategies should we use to make sense of the transnational circulation of Tad's 1898 work? Well, there are many people in this room who have dedicated their professional careers to studying the global circulation of educational thinking, educational policies, and educational practices. There is, as many will know, a significant body of scholarship that looks at educational borrowing and transfer, frequently trying to model the steps and variables as this illustration from 2 decades ago attempted. Fortunately, though, we here are historians and not social scientists. That may be fighting words, I don't know. But we know that a world always in a process of becoming cannot be captured in universal formulas. Of course, tracing lines of influence is an important part of doing intellectual history, But there are also real limitations to some of the received studies of education reform that we should confront. And I've been very fortunate to work with Tom Popkowitz, who I think is here in the room somewhere, and I contributed a piece to this particular volume he put together. In it, I discussed the challenges of doing transnational work on education reform and proposed that it can be very useful to think in terms of assemblages, apparatuses, and accept that the things in our world get tangled together in some messy and amazing ways. Some of you will know, as was mentioned, that I also wear the hat of a comparative education researcher. And in my 2017 CIS presidential address, I tried to develop some ideas about crisscrossing comparative education as a strategy for gaining insight into transnational circulations in education. So let me try and quickly present some of the key ideas here, as they're going to bear on what I'm going to try and do with Liberty Tad, Radoslavljevic, Yugoslavia, etc. So in studying transnational networks, connections, exchanges, one important thing is to attend to the ways that our work stabilizes in time and space. Now, there's a strong intuitive allure to thinking in terms of transfer, right? X moves from A to B. And yes, sometimes there is a simple kind of bilateral movement of an educational practice, policy, theory in one direction. But I would say that in many instances, there are actually multiple crisscrossings of reciprocal, even reversible, and multiple movements and exchanges. And Werner and Zimmerman's writing on Histoire croisée is useful here, of course. Of course, as historians, an interest in change over time is a constant for us. But we should also be cautious about rushing to a this then that diachronic logic that freezes time so that a cross-sectional object can be stabilized and seen accurate. We head down a treacherous path if we start by saying, okay, what was the real Dewey, and then how was that changed in Y place, right? So points of departure and arrival are typically complex, non-uniform, and constantly shifting assemblages. So that's one point to bear in mind. The second is that in this work, the project of deprovincializing a nation-state-centered approach is actually more of a challenge, I think, than it sometimes seems. Because there's a risk that in talking about influences that are outside and then moving inside, we actually are reaffirming the national container, right, that we're trying to complicate in our research. An example of this would be when we take a society, right, as a single domain that's coextensive with national territory, that's discrete and bounded, even if diverse and stratified. So I have found it profitable to employ the concept of entangled history, which focuses on the messy tangling together of different actors, devices, discourses, and practices. And importantly, recognizes that some of these connections, some of this tangling is present in the historical material itself, the said actors, devices, discourses, and practices. But some of it is also done, that's accomplished by the historian themselves. So I see entangled history as both emerging from the archive and being introduced by the historian. And parenthetically, I would put forth Laura Stoller's work on intimate histories as, to me, a brilliant example of the historian's own role in drawing connections, entangling, when the archival material doesn't always make this evident. All right, one more thing. Why do this at all, right? I've set up the problem, I've suggested a method. There's still this question. What makes this worthwhile, right? Add lines to a CV, get tenure and promotion, improve the impact factor of Pedagogica Historica. There's a lot that could be said, right, about Paul Radoslavljevic's introducing a possibly obscure American art educator, by then deceased for over a decade, to a Yugoslav educational public in 1927 and 1928. But so what, right? It has to connect to something meaningful, right? I hope so. This is not to say that matters of fact are not important, right? I mean, in our truth-challenged contemporary world, one of our tasks as historians is to be the adults in the room when it comes to fact, right? But beyond matters of fact, I believe our scholarship should also be motivated by matters of concern. Now, I've returned to this material on TAD and Yugoslavia at various points over the past 20 years. And recently, a series of possible connecting lines began to emerge. In some of the languages spoken here at ISCHE, we're talking about a red line, a meaningful through line, or a through story. And I hope that it will be proved meaningful to tell some stories about human potential. TAD's 1898 book is doing a lot of things, but one thing that seems to have caught the attention of some is the way it opens a gap and speaks about the realization of something that does not yet exist. You know, or as in the quote from Radosławiewicz on the right here, that you should now recognize, without Hall and TAD, I cannot imagine that Americans would have attained their present heights. So as this quote suggests, the transformative realization or actualization could actually come to exist for some. In working on this, I've even thought about my own artistic potential. That's me and my own work, following a self-administered James Literary TAD drawing course. You'll be spared a performance today, but over the course of the last month, I spent several days a week going through his book in one of the vacant classrooms at my university. All right, now let's dive in and explore these new methods that were so hugely popular a century ago, plus or minus. So, work on the chalkboard was at the center. And as you know, the first image that jumped out to me was the nature study in the pigsty. But TAD proposed that there was value to be had both from nature study and from manual training drill work. And in fact, students are to start with the latter. So the first exercise he called for was the circle, which should be drawn at chin height and as an arm movement. Quote, "Let there be an easy swing of the arm from the shoulder, keeping the remainder of the body in easy, comfortable position and carefully avoiding rigidity of the muscles. No tight grip on the chalk. Every movement must be as easy and free and graceful as possible." From circles, we move on to lines, straight lines. The people standing, quote, "in the same position as before must swing the hand up and down vertically, making a line about 18 inches in length." And then we move to loops, then the double loop. To quote TAD, quote, "Very few beginners can draw it so that it will be erect. Usually the force of the writing habit asserts itself, and a great many pupils tip this form to the right." And I can attest from personal experience that this remains true some 120 odd years later. Then we get to some of the most pleasing things to draw, the spiral, which lends itself to decoration, the crocket, which builds off of this, and most importantly, the anthemion, as you see being drawn here with two hands. Back to this in a second, which appears on the cover of TAD's book. Quote, "The anthemion is a fundamental Greek form. It has balance, proportion, fitness, grace, and beauty." And then from there, students move on to scroll work, leaves, combinations of leaf and scroll work, strap work, decorative borders, and the like. It may be hard to tell from this photo, but these are African American girls in the last picture, which is of some importance, as we'll soon discuss. We haven't gotten yet to nature study, nor the clay modeling or wood carving that was also part of TAD's methods. But let's get right to the chase. What's the secret sauce here, right? Well, let's let Paul Radosławiewicz tell us. Tajna Tadowa metoda, the secret of TAD's method. The secret of Tad's method consists in the fact that it is not a strictly differentiated system. It gives great freedom to both the teacher and the student. The main thing is that the pupils are developing. It's not so much the amount of schooling being provided, which szkolski kwantitet, school quantity, which is a great phrase, as that each is developing according to their potential, right? Prema njegovim mogućnostima. You could translate mogućnost as possibility, but here I think it's appropriate to translate it as potential into English. Now remember, Radosławiewicz is interested in what heights these techniques have allowed Americans to reach. And in another section, he describes Tad's work as pointing out the, quote, Achilles heel, Aholova peta, of Yugoslav education's strict procedures and systems being the weak point. All right, now I think we can clear the screen and spend a moment on the figure behind the chalkboard, the one who's serving an author function here, James Liberty Tad. It'll be worth learning more about him. He lived from 1853 to 1917. Who was James Liberty Tad? I'm pretty sure this is a photograph of him conducting a co-ed and interracial night school wood carving class in a church basement in Philadelphia at some point in the 1890s. And this may be him posing nude for his students, as reproduced from the book in the 1928 Radna Škola article. Born at sea to a ship captain from Cornwall, England, the story is that his middle name, Liberty, comes from his father's staunch opposition to slavery, which apparently includes an episode in New Orleans Harbor where the elder Tad refused to return an enslaved African-American harbor worker to his purported owner and sailed off with him to freedom. James Liberty Tad, the son, moved to the United States at an early age, traveling in the company of his contemporary, the British painter John Wimbush, one of his paintings right here, the toy seller. Wimbush was a friend of the American painter James Whistler. Tad settled in Philadelphia and studied for a while with the great American painter Thomas Eakins. So he's interestingly networked into some transatlantic art worlds. Tad became an art educator, and the main institution he was associated with was the Industrial Art School of Philadelphia, itself established in 1880 by Charles Godfrey Leland, a poet, journalist, and art educator who had actually spent most of the 1870s in Europe, where he became acquainted with John Ruskin and William Morris, two of the leading figures of the British arts and crafts movement. Okay, so my point in mentioning all of this is just to emphasize that this art manual and Tad's work overall was enmeshed in a tangled network of multiple Atlantic crossings. And now we move from Philadelphia to Chicago in 1893. Many of us in this room know the value of studying the international expositions or the World's Fairs when tracing and reconstructing transnational educational movements. This is the floor plan of the education exhibit area in 1893, and the Chicago Fair was certainly significant for Tad, as apparently his exhibit attracted attention for being much more lively than the rows of photographs and framed samples of student work, such as you see here. Tad set up, you guessed it, a blackboard, 20 feet, about 6 meters long, and you're going to have to use your imaginations to see the circles, the loops, the enthemions, and the other drawings that would have been created on it daily. Now, it's here that Tad met an important figure, William Haleman, a Swiss-born American educated as a Pestalozzian. Haleman translated Froebel into English and was important in introducing the kindergarten in America, though not as important as he's sometimes credited because a lot of women were really pivotal. Haleman wrote on the 1893 fair as follows: From booth to booth I had gone and seen the walls plastered over with weak imitations of the thoughts, or no thoughts, of some system maker, until my soul grew sick with the musty odors of darkness and decay, when at last the display of the work of this school, Tad School, burst upon my weariness. And I think it's worth going on for a bit. Haleman continued, in the ordinary school, which labors to force all minds into the same arbitrary molds of traditional mediocrity, the teacher is forever dictating, directing, holding up effete patterns, obsolete ideals that have no vital meaning in the life of the child. In this school, Tad School, as I saw it at the exposition, this was not the case. Here the pupils seemed to lead. He fairly felt himself growing. New revelations of this power came to him at every turn. He lived himself into confidence in his own power to think and to express thought. He lived himself into confidence. What a wonderful turn of phrase and way of thinking about potential being realized. In numerous contemporary sources, Haleman is credited with popularizing Tad to a broader American educational public. At the time of the Chicago encounter, he was superintendent of schools in LaPorte, Indiana, but became superintendent of the US government's Indian School Service, right, which incorporated the reservation and the notorious off-reservation boarding schools the next year. Haleman also seems to have been important for the intellectual articulation of Tad's work. His expertise on Pestalozzi seems to have helped Tad maybe flesh out the theory behind his practice. There's a lot of Emerson, even some strong parallels to Bronson Alcott. They also come into Tad's new methods. These are not strands, though, I want to fully chase out right now. I just want to note, as many know, right, that transnational reflections on manual training were an extremely significant part of global educational circulations in the 19th and early 20th centuries. You know, in the American educational historiography, Lawrence Kremen argued that alongside Jacob Ries's photographs, it was the Russian technical exhibit of Delafoss's work at the 1876 exposition in Philadelphia that spurred a progressive transformation of the American school. Some of you are familiar with that argument. Tad, too, frequently appears as a subject of international comparative gaze. The Yugoslav example that we opened is but one. Omar Bouiz's 1908 Méthode américaine d'éducation générale et technique dedicates a considerable number of pages to Liberty Tad's methods. In fact, we almost learn more about what was happening in America with respect to Tad's drawing methods from some of these outside sources like Bouize and Radosławiewicz than we do from American sources. There was a German translation of Tad's book. It had considerable influence in Hamburg, it seems. But as I said at the beginning, Tad is basically unreferenced in the American educational historiography, which is particularly striking because there's one report that his book had sold 10,000 copies by 1912, which is an enormous number. All right. Be you transformed by the renewing of the mind. Okay, there's still two things we need to return to. The ambidextrous drawing with left and right hands and the ways nature study fit in. So in her work on the refinement across the 1800s of knowledge about the hemispheric activities of the human brain, historian of science Anne Harrington proposes that the 19th century's discussion of left-right polarities of mind, were a reflection in the scientific discourse of social anxieties, kind of a nagging worry about the fragility of humanity's victory over its brutish past, left-right, right? For Tad, it seems a little simpler, merely that symmetry, balance, and the chance to develop different sets of muscles was the main reason. If a potential for greater accomplishments exists, it behooves us to develop it, he seems to have argued. There was a vogue for ambidexterity at the turn of the 20th century, but Tad seems to have been marginal to this. For example, he does not call for sketching or painting with the left hand, the non-dominant hand, for many. but rather focuses on doing the large muscle movements with both hands. And I can tell you from personal experience that there is something particularly pleasing about developing this skill, especially as it comes surprisingly quickly. All right, now just a word about TAD's students. One of the most celebrated pupils of James Liberty Tad was the American architect Louis Kahn. Born in Estonia, immigrating to the US at a young age, Kahn attended one of Tad's schools. He later famously designed the Yale Art Museum and the government complex in what's now Dhaka, Bangladesh. And apparently some of Tad's teachings stuck. And across his life, he would demonstrate the ambidextrous drawing he had learned, including a two-handed enthemion, created here, I think, in the late 1950s. Kahn's partner for 29 years was Ann Ting. Now, side note, I know there are people here who are interested in wooden children's toys, including colorful canaries. If you don't know it, check out the Ting toy, which using these same plywood pieces and dowels can be turned into a desk, also an airplane, T-wagon, car, and hobby horse. It's fascinating, but we need to pack that back up. And look at a school building she designed in 1951-52. It was actually never built. This is a photograph of a scale model, and it's hard to see and doesn't blow up very well because of the quality of the image. But the blackboard prepared for the school shows illustrations right out of Liberty Tad's 1898 book. Now, I'm not an architectural historian or an expert on the influences Kahn and Ting had on one another, but it does seem there was some joint work here, as I think Kahn would have been the one to introduce or at least inspire the Tad-influenced drawings on the blackboard of this proposed school in 1951. All right, now in fact, the animal drawings take us back to our last outstanding point, which is the nature study aspect of Tad's new methods. Tad believed that there can be a right return from nature study if we make the right use of opportunities. We must make our children realize the divinity that is planted in things. We are compelled to be matter in this world, be with matter in this world. We cannot lift children above the commonplace. Instead, we should thrust our heads into it until they recognize their mother nature. Nature was to be drawn in the wild, from specimens and from memory. And as you see, Tad felt it important to pay attention to the form, and capture the natural form from as many angles and perspectives as possible. And in fact, before coloring and shading come in, Tad recommends that students move into modeling with clay and carving with wood. Now, returning quickly from technique to author, after making acquaintance with Haleman, and particularly with the publication of his book in 1898, Tad seems to have become a frequent speaker at education events around the United States. In 1899, he spoke at Illinois' Cook County Normal School, and Colonel Parker, who ran it, and also the Eamon Blaine School, which was maybe the greatest competitor to Dewey's Lab School, was so impressed that he sent a delegation of teachers to Tad's summer school in the Adirondacks. At the end of June 1900, Tad spoke at the Eastern Manual Training Association in Cleveland, Ohio, and we have an interesting record of the discussion. According to the report, the speaker dwelt with much earnestness on the importance of giving the child to realize the potentialities of their being. And as you will know, kind of mid-level report-like sources like this can be really useful for telling us how an exchange of ideas played out. Tad was challenged on the wisdom of cultivating automatic movement. You don't need to read all this. I'll tell you the key parts. A Mr. Upton proposed that as soon as a process becomes automatic, it loses its chief value. But Tad replied that while the control of the muscle is automatic, the mind of the pupil was fully engaged. And in fact, there's a really interesting kind of dreamy element of absorption of Tad's students in their work. This may sound like I'm going out on a limb, perhaps I am, but since we're in Hungary, let's bring up Csikszentmihalyi and the notion of flow. You know, flow states weren't just brought into existence when Csikszentmihalyi wrote about them in 1975, right? But probably have manifested and been experienced in human cultures in different ways for millennia. through spiritual practices, psychedelics, probably also through labor and leisure. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that TAD's methods show dimensions of cultivating flow. You know, the psychology of optimal experience and being transformed by the renewing of the mind are certainly distant from one another in some respects, but they're actually close in others, particularly in terms of trying to find ways to understand and access the upper possibility spaces of human experience. So I'm about to branch out, moving away from TAD, but I need to say a little bit more about the racial and racialized crisscrossings entangled here. So tellingly, TAD's speech in Cleveland was followed by a Mr. Arthur Craig speaking on industrial education at the Tuskegee Normal Institute, which perhaps most of you will know was an African-American serving institution. A 1902 study by Thomas Benguff, published by the Education Department of Ontario, Canada, also put the two right next to one another, calling TAD's methods learning how to do, and the Hampton-Tuskegee approach learning by doing. Now, going too deep into this would be opening up massive debates in American educational historiography. Benguff's description of Hampton is exceedingly descriptive. His treatment of TAD is different, goes into theory and rationale, probably because he had just spent the previous summer in the Adirondacks at the summer camp. But he does cite a 1902 article in the Southern Workman, which is a Hampton-sponsored journal on TAD's methods, which says, "We wish to especially to endorse Mr. TAD's thought that we first should discover capacity, then educate it, instead of giving to all pupils alike the same kind of training. But we protest against the abolition of the useful model. It seems to us that the useful should be retained, but should be made artistic." Now, recalling that TAD was given the name Liberty for a strong reason, and noting that the African-American students here referred to as colored pupils are explicitly and purposefully portrayed in his book, I believe TAD intended to show them as possessing full potential. We do know that the famous African-American sculptor Meadowvaux Warwick Fuller studied with TAD as a high school student in Philadelphia, and that he included a carving of hers in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair exhibit. This is Fuller's 1919 statue of Mary Turner, who had been lynched the year before in Georgia while 8 months pregnant. The story is horrific, and it was frequently brought up by the NAACP in the 1920s. What was done to the baby is really disturbing, but if there were ever a parable about human potential smothered, this is one. All right, now let's draw some things together before we head off again. So what I've been trying to do here, in a deliberately somewhat tangled way, is use the different actors, devices, discourses, and practices that crisscross with Jane's Liberty TAD to draw out some observations on human potential. As I said earlier, the idiom of potential exposes a gap and allows us to talk about something that does not yet exist. We have seen people using the term potential and using a conceptual apparatus associated with it to name something about themselves and other people. For TAD and others around his art education manual, there were hidden latent capacities that could be brought to manifest themselves through artistic activity that was trained both to be automatic and was also suffused with connections to the natural world, to symmetry, and to beauty. So I think On Offer was a form of manual training less attuned to the needs of industry than it was to the perceived needs of humanity. You know, industrial automation was feared, and I have not had time to discuss the critiques of the Swedish Sloyd system. But the automatic actions developed by a mind aware that it is attaining new powers, this was something to be welcomed. Be ye transformed by the renewing of the mind. And in some ways, this is a story of education and modernity. You know, Bernadette Baker, in her book on William James, talks about a transformation in the concept of Bildung across the 18th and 19th century as it comes to refer not just to passive recipients of pre-existing forms, but also to individuals who now gradually develop their own innate potential through their interaction with the environment. If you know Bernadette's work on power and motion, we are here circa 1900, where the Lockean child, who indicates its modernness through its Newtonian and possessive inscription of power as force, as capacity, as relational, meets the developing child of a child study that is a multiplicity of powers that were believed to be its heredity and its future, and therefore itself. Developing one's own potential, I think that is what Radoslavljevic was tuning into when he lifted up TAD in 1927 as the allegedly most influential American educator, and also as co-responsible with G. Stanley Hall for the heights which America had reached. Now, this suggests that individual potential sometimes scales up to collective potential, which is basically the theme I'm now going to take up. Remember I said earlier that an entangled history approach is partly accomplished by the archival material and in part by the historian, and now I'm going to conclude by moving into an area that's purely my own conjuring. So now we're heading off the map. Speaking of things that are popular among teachers, this is what is known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I don't think I need to tell you. Brainchild of the psychologist Abraham Maslow. The pyramidal form is not actually originally his, but it was attached by a marketing executive later. And I'd submit that this schema of human needs exerts a powerful force in the world today. Though Maslow and others worked against the straitjacket that Freud gave to psychology for decades, to understand this chart, it's actually worth saying something about Maslow's mother, sorry, Freud, who apparently was a pretty horrible person. She austerely regulated the food available in the household, so no wonder that food appears as a basic psychological need. She once destroyed a set of 78 records that young Abe had collected, saying it was a wasteful hobby. And there was one time in his childhood when young Maslow brought home two kittens he'd found on the street in New York City. He was caring for them, and she smashed their heads against a concrete wall in front of him. Sorry, you will never think of the Maslow's hierarchy again the same way. So it's no surprise then that love is foundational. And it might help also to explain why, one of the most persistent, certainly recent critiques of this schema is the relative absence of relationality. Again, apologies that was unnecessarily Freudian. Okay, but what's important here, I think, is the self-actualization at the top of the pyramid. To quote Maslow, this need we may call self-actualization. It refers to the human desire for self-fulfillment, namely to the tendency for all of us to become actualized in what we are potentially. This tendency might be phrased as the desire to become more and more what one is, to become everything that one is capable of becoming. So far, so good, perhaps. What man can be, he must be, is one of Maslow's most known taglines. Hashtag lines. And we have seen the realization, I would say, the idea of realizing potential being put to important progressive political use. In the civil rights struggle around education in the United States, both before and after the Brown decision, the realization of potential and its accompanying conceptual apparatus was arguably put to good use by activists seeking to improve education and educational experiences and opportunities for African Americans. I've picked Maslow, but he was not alone. Between 1930 and 1970, a group of like-minded thinkers, Alfred Adler, Charlotte Buehler, Viktor Frankl, Erich Fromm, Karen Horney, Sidney Girard, Carl Rogers, right? These are people who all saw limits in the experimental psychology, limits in behaviorism, limits in Freudian psychoanalysis, who felt that these disciplines did not do justice to the individual as a whole, that they left behind humanity's immense potential for creativity, spirituality, and humanism. But there's a big problem here, which is that Maslow seems to have maintained that only a small portion of human beings could actually self-actualize. Strong shades of Nietzsche here. And this is not something we have necessarily put aside. But let's move on, because I did promise that we would get to Big Sur, California. And where we're briefly going is the Esalen Institute. Dan Perlstein is a docent here. And in fact, Maslow showed up here too. The story, apparently true, is that he and his wife were looking for a hotel late one evening, pulled into these hot springs, and discovered that the staff had actually been reading his work. So for the sake of simplicity, we can locate the human potential movement of the 1960s and 1970s. One of the central nodes was at Esalen. Apparently, this was a very exciting time to be there. There was an anything goes kind of spirit. And Maslow, in fact, himself became disenchanted with some of the disregard for research. So I'm doing this too quickly, making too much fun of it, but I do think that questions about the upper possibility spaces of human experience warrant our attention. Paul Radoslavljevic believed that he had found a path to this in the work of James Liberty Tadd. And if I'm right about the connection to flow states, and if Tadd is right about art and ethics and the good society, then we're maybe onto something. But self-actualization for who and for what purposes? Yeah, I hate to do this, but I'm going to do it. Elon Musk is getting ready to run off to Mars, right? And take a set of people with tremendous potential with him. And again, I am not making this up. He actually did blast a Tesla into space, launch it into a solar orbit. So certainly imperfectly, and definitely in a very weird way, although blackboards are cool, James Liberty Tadd suggested a much more democratic realization of human potential than we currently see circulating around Big Sur and Silicon Valley, California today. And I actually think it's really legitimate to draw these two together, because they're moments where human beings and human societies are being confronted with the fruits, the consequences of our technological labors, and where we are asking what it is possible for us to become. So now let's celebrate the Tesla of this room right here, right now, examine our own potential, not the Teslas of other worlds, and move on to the reception. Thank you very much.